Welcome, everybody. We are so delighted that you're here tonight to be part of what will be a wonderful conversation between two giants in their respective fields, Stephanie Plunkett and Dr. Jane Tillman. My name is Mary Burley. I'm the chief educator here at the Rockwell Museum. And this tonight is the launch of our Art, Love, and Identity lecture series, which will go for the next 6 Tuesdays at 4:30. Tom Daly, who is nearby, has the full list to hand out in case anybody's wondering. We have one shift next week, July 16th, the head of character development at Sesame Street, Lewis Henry Mitchell, will be with us. So we hope to see you, not just tonight, but again through the summer. And I just want to share a little bit about Jane and Stephanie as we launch tonight's conversation about the relationship between Erik Erikson and Norman Rockwell. Dr. Tillman is the Evelyn Stephenson Neff Director of the Erik Erikson Institute for Education and Research at Austen Riggs, our neighbor on Main Street. A board-certified clinical psychologist and a psychoanalyst, Dr. Tillman is an assistant clinical professor at the Yale Child Study Center and a teaching associate in psychiatry at the Cambridge Health Alliance of Harvard Medical School. She serves on the editorial boards of Psychoanalytic Psychology and the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association. She's presented and published on a wide variety of topics, including dissociation, psychosis, religion, impasses in treatment, embodiment, clinical and professional ethics, research methodology, identifying markers for acute risk of suicide, and the effect of patient suicide on clinicians. Dr. Tillman attended the University of the South and received her undergraduate degree from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She earned a master's in divinity from Duke University, a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and completed a pre-doctoral internship at Dartmouth Medical School. I think many of us in this room also know Jane as the associate pastor of St. Paul's Church in Stockbridge. So as we think about all of our connections to Main Street and each other, this is really remarkable and exciting. Stephanie also is just an extraordinary person. She is the Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the Norman Rockwell Museum, and she's in her 26th year here. She's 25th? 24th. I did so 1994.
Right, so I think it's going to be in September. It'll be 25.
Okay, you can see I did my own research.
Thank you.
So 24th year, many years, and really quite wonderful. A lot to show for it. The recipient of a Master of Fine Arts degree from the School of Visual Arts, Illustration as Visual Essay Program. She is the author of 2 American Library Association notable children's books and the curator of scores of exhibitions exploring the art of Norman Rockwell and the field of illustration. This season, Stephanie curated both of the Rockwell exhibits on view. And I think what has really been fun about leading up to this season is seeing Stephanie and Jane work together, go to the Houghton Library and really have fun.
With you.
I was a lucky recipient of, I was on for the ride, but a very, very exciting to see both Stephanie and Jane sharing their gifts with each other and being in conversation about what the connection between Rockwell and Erikson meant for all of us and the world. And I think that's really the takeaway watching this from the side. So thank you so much, both of you, for being here, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Mary. Well, we are so happy you're all here. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for that beautiful introduction, Mary. Jane, I have to thank you for being such an extraordinary partner in this process of the exhibition. It was really exciting to bring our 2 organizations together. Norman Rockwell Museum, 50 years old, and the Austen Riggs Center, 100 years old. So I wonder if you might want to say a little bit about how this exhibition came about, because it kind of has a fun story, I think.
It does have a fun story. 2 summers ago, I was aware that in 2 years it would be the Austen Riggs Centennial, which is a big event for us that we have been able to survive 100 years, keeping to our mission, providing psychiatric care to patients on Main Street in a fully open setting. So in today's mental health landscape, to still be here after 100 years is a big deal. So I wanted us to find a way to celebrate that, and I thought, oh, maybe an exhibition. Now I'm a psychologist and psychoanalyst. I know nothing about any of this, so I called Laurie Norton Moffat, expert, and we went to lunch, and I asked Laurie, what should we do for an exhibition? And Laurie gently reminded me that Austen Riggs had just purchased the old corner house, which had been the first home of the Rockwell Museum, and she said, you should have an exhibition there. That's kind of what the house is good for in some ways. But then out of that conversation grew the opportunity to have this collaboration with the Rockwell Museum, which has just been spectacular for us. So I want to thank Laurie, and I want to thank you, Stephanie, and Venus, and all the members of the Rockwell staff who have been so collaborative and fun in this project.
Thank you. It's been wonderful to bring our organizations together. So the exhibition actually looks at the ways in which 2 giants, each in completely different fields, really impacted each other. And in Rockwell's case, the ways in which Rockwell's art was really transformed in many ways by the kinds of interactions that he had with Erik Erikson. And I wonder, I know many here are initiated, but would you want to say a little bit about Erikson, maybe who he was, as a person, as an immigrant, a teacher, a psychotherapist, all those things?
I will. It's a fascinating story. So Erik Erikson was born in 1902, just outside of Frankfurt, Germany, but he was Danish. But his mother had become pregnant out of wedlock, and the family sent her off to Frankfurt to have this child, and she had Erik. The mother was from a well-to-do Jewish family in Copenhagen, and they sent her to Frankfurt, and he was born. And while there, she met Theodor Hamburger. And Erik, by this time, was about 3 years old, and they got married, and Theodor Hamburger was a pediatrician, and he adopted Erik Erikson. But Erikson did not look like he belonged in this Jewish family in many ways, because he had blonde hair and blue eyes. And so I think that was confusing for him growing up, to find his place in this very anti-Semitic time, where he didn't quite fit, at least by looks, in his family, and certainly at school was teased and bullied for being Jewish. And of course, it was hard for him to find a place. So his interest in identity starts very early, with lack of knowledge about his paternity, and being sort of in the middle of several cultures and not knowing exactly how to figure that out. He was very interested in art. We saw when we went to the Houghton Library, we saw the original woodcuts of prints he made. They were just spectacular, and we handled the actual prints on very thin paper, and there was still ink on those blocks, which is extraordinary. And because I don't know about art, Stephanie was able to tell me that Erikson was a talented artist.
Oh my goodness.
I would have had no way to evaluate that. So that was wonderful to learn that. So he went to Vienna as a very young man. He was wandering around, kind of lost, I think, very confused. And he wound up working at a nursery school that Anna Freud and her colleagues ran in Vienna. And he was a nursery school teacher. And Anna Freud saw his talent in working with children and took him into psychoanalysis. That was the route to becoming a psychoanalyst at that time, was to go into analysis with a well-known analyst. And Anna Freud certainly had the credential for that. And she analyzed Erik Erikson, and he took courses at the Vienna Psychoanalytic Institute. He became an analyst. And he met a Canadian woman, Joan Serson, at the time, a dancer over, she was also in Vienna, and they wound up getting married. And when 1933 came, Joan and Erik were very worried about the Nazis. And the Freuds were not. The Freuds said, they're not going to come here. They will not come to Austria. But the Eriksons felt very differently about this. They tried to go back and get citizenship in Denmark, and he was denied citizenship in Denmark. So they were able to come to the United States in 1933. He taught at Harvard. Now this is a man with no advanced degree, just a high school degree. But the credential of being close to the Freuds and being a psychoanalyst had some cachet at that time. And so he worked at Harvard, and then went to Yale for a time, and then to Berkeley, California. And while in Berkeley, he was always sort of in between departments because he didn't have an advanced degree, and he was, by that time it was well established that he was not an empirical researcher. He had kept, at Harvard he had worked with Henry Murray in personality studies, but not a researcher. And in 1949, 1950, with the concern about communism in this country, the University of California system asked faculty to sign a loyalty oath that they were not involved with the Communist Party. And Erikson didn't want to sign this, and he was tortured about it. He went back and forth, should I, shouldn't I? Faculty were being fired if they chose not to sign this. He didn't sign it. They offered him a tenured professorship anyway, but then he resigned several months later. And at that time, Robert Knight, the director of the Austen Riggs Center, had often been trying to recruit Erikson over the years. They felt like the time was right. So they recruited Erikson more, and he came to Stockbridge in 1951 and was at the Austen Riggs Center for about 10 years, leaving 1960, around 1960, 61 to return to Harvard to teach. But he was an excellent clinician, from what I hear, a thoughtful writer, and very interested in the intersection between the individual and culture and society. He was interested not only, as psychoanalysts are, in the inner world, but the outer world that shapes a life. So,
thank you. That's a beautiful description. Yeah. I'll just mention that on the screen are two portraits by Norman Rockwell. In 1962, in appreciation for the work that the senior doctors at Riggs had done for Rockwell and his family, Rockwell created a series of very impressive portraits, which actually are owned by Riggs now.
Right. They hang in our lobby.
Hanging in the lobby, so they can actually be seen in the flesh, which is great. Jane just mentioned Dr. Robert Knight, who you actually see on your left. And of course, the portrait on the right is of Erik Erikson. And it's wonderful to have them in the exhibition. I'll just go back because there's something kind of fun here. So Rockwell, of course, being a narrative artist and a realist painter, always was very meticulous about his reference. And so what you're actually seeing here is some of the photographic reference from our archive of Erikson himself. On the right is a letter from Joan Erikson, which is in the exhibition. And this has really been fun to bring the two collections together, because Riggs had some really important materials in their archives, and we had some wonderful things. And many thanks to Venus Van Ness in our archives, who was tremendously helpful in organizing the exhibition. And the letter basically says, from Joan, says, well, we're very excited about the portrait, but Erik's left eye is inflamed, and we hope that you'll make sure to remove that from the final drawing. And in a subsequent letter, Erik Erikson wrote to say that not only was his eye inflamed, and please remove that or fix it, but also he wasn't happy with his mustache, the trimming of his mustache. So Rockwell fixed those things in the final portrait, and it turned out beautifully. I wonder if you would want to say a little bit about why Erikson's work was important.
I think Erikson's work was important because he took what he learned in Vienna from the Freuds, and then he enlarged that. Freud was very much interested in early development and felt development stopped around puberty, really. And Erikson thought, no, development goes on throughout life. We're always in the process of becoming or developing ourselves. So I think that enlarged psychoanalysis. And Erikson was also interested in the outer world. And this became a source of real tension between Erikson and Anna Freud. They felt like he was departing a bit too much by paying attention to the outer world. But he was very interested in culture and society and how that shapes identity. And I think that is his other very significant contribution, not only to psychoanalysis, but I think the way we think in our culture today is the fundamental nature of who we are over time, and the phrase he used over and over again in a way that hangs together. Do we have an identity that's coherent enough, not that's fixed and rigid for all time, but that hangs together and has a kind of coherence to it that allows us to have some continuity within ourselves and to the people who know us. So this idea of identity, now we take for granted, and it's such a major issue in our culture right now. And Erikson brought that to the fore as sort of the founder and writer on identity, and he was interested in adolescent development. So he also coined the term identity crisis, which he thinks is part of a developmental phase that adolescents go through as they seek to separate from home, leave their parents, come to their own values, their own way of being in the world, that maybe retains some similarities with their parents, but also differentiates from their parents. And he was very interested in the adolescent identity crisis. And of course that it describes some of the patients we treat at Riggs, young adults who get into this identity crisis in a profound way that's not so easily workable, and they need some help. So he learned a lot about identity crisis at Riggs. His Childhood and Society book was published in 1950, the year before he came to Riggs, but after that, he really did take an interest in adolescence and work more on this issue of identity and identity crisis, which served him well when he went back to Harvard in the 60s, in this great time of social unrest and adolescent upheaval. And he was right on the scene with a way to listen to people beyond a kind of moral judgment about their behavior, but to try to understand, well, what is it? What are they telling us?
I think that's something that Rockwell must have found incredibly helpful in his therapy with Erik Erikson. As we understand it, Rockwell became acquainted with Erikson because his wife Mary was seeking treatment at the Austen Riggs Center, and she was struggling with alcoholism and depression. And so in 1951, when the Rockwells were living in Arlington, Vermont, Mary began treatment actually with Dr. Robert Knight here, who was the medical director. And they would come from Arlington several times a week, and in fact Mary was admitted for full-time treatment, but Rockwell was then coming back and forth very frequently. And that was a difficult schedule for a very busy illustrator. But in 1952, he began treatment himself with Erik Erikson. He thought he might seek treatment with Dr. Knight, but Dr. Knight said,
I can't treat you and your wife.
Right. So they began a very close and productive relationship from what we can tell. And I think Erikson was a tremendous support to Rockwell in a variety of ways. Rockwell, we know, was struggling in certain ways with his identity as an illustrator, with struggles around his artwork, and of course with some of the family issues that he was encountering. So Erikson, I think, was a very open-hearted individual who had also, as you say, had been an artist, and even said himself that he came to psychology from art.
Right. And you have captured in your exhibition so beautifully some of the sketches and the doodles he would do while listening to patients or in case conferences. So he was very visual in the way he planned his books, outlined things, very much visual in the way he worked. Of course, English was his second language, and he struggled with that, to learn that. Most of my source material comes from a biography by Larry Friedman, Identity's Architect, about Erikson, and he talks about the struggle to, when you immigrate at the age of around 30, to learn a second language at that time. So I think Erikson relied on his visual skills, I think, to shape his ideas. And I can imagine he just must have looked up to Norman Rockwell, because Erikson was all about American identity. Even before he gets to Riggs, in his Childhood and Society book, he writes a chapter on American identity. He's kind of enthralled with who we are as Americans, in the way he conceptualized it coming to this country. And I think who better to capture American identity and its ideals than Rockwell. So, and I think Rockwell was about 10 years older than Erikson, so I can imagine Erikson also had great admiration for Rockwell.
So I'll just mention that this was another very significant doctor at
Dr. Margaret Brennan Gibson.
Yeah. Do you want to say a little bit about her?
Sure. When Robert Knight came here in 1947, he came from the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas, which is a very large psychiatric hospital and training facility. And he brought 5 staff members with him from Menninger. And Margaret Brennan Gibson was one of them, young, very brilliant psychologist, and the first woman to be a psychologist to be a psychoanalyst through the American Psychoanalytic Association, largely because Robert Knight sponsored her and saw her through that process. She was a researcher in hypnosis, and later very interested in nuclear war and how to slow that down, and also wrote a very important biography on the playwright Clifford Odette. She married Bill Gibson, a playwright, wrote The Miracle Worker, Cobweb, plays of that sort. So she was a very important figure at Riggs after she came here in the late 40s.
And also, I think, served as Mary Rockwell's doctor as
I
well.
believe that's in one of the biographies. The thing that we've had to navigate very carefully in this exhibition is at Riggs, we're not at liberty to say anything about patients or about clinical care. So we've had to hold to that, but luckily there are all these biographers, and there's a lot of stuff in the public domain. So what I say is, it comes from these publicly available documents, but that fact that Dr. Brennan Gibson was involved in Rockwell's wife's care is in some of the biographical material that's public.
This actually is a beautiful drawing that Rockwell did of Dr. Brennan Gibson, and the photograph on the right, I guess on your left, is one of the reference photographs that Rockwell took. He took several different poses. Some were frontal. There was a 3/4 pose, and this he told Erikson he felt was the most elegant of all the poses. Erikson was very careful about actually helping to kind of curate the poses of each of the doctors that Rockwell was drawing. So that was kind of a nice thing to discover.
Right, they were collaborating, and I get, and from the letters that we came upon, it does seem like Rockwell had to have a lot of patience and take a lot of direction from both Joan and Erik Erikson. I can't imagine as an artist having that direction.
Right, he appeared conciliatory on the surface, but then, you know, in the last sentence of a letter, he'd say, "But this is really the best pose." So
yeah,
that's what he went with. Yeah,
but that was very interesting.
On the screen, we actually have from your archives a document showing the 8 stages of human development with Erikson's hand notes on it. And as I came to look at some of the materials from the archives, it seems that he was constantly editing himself. Is that the case?
He was, in developing this 8 stages of human development was first in his book, 1950 book that sort of put him on the map, Childhood and Society, but he reworked it over and over again. He published Insight and Responsibility, and he enlarged these developmental stages to include virtues in that edition. Late in his life, they added a 9th stage. He and his wife, towards the very end of their life, added a 9th stage of development about old age, when people were physically in serious decline. And so I think he was working on this model of development all the time and revising it and adding to it.
And he was quite famous, really in the news pretty frequently in his time, from what we could tell.
He was. I think he was. There are people in the audience who knew him personally,
Yeah,
so
that's
it's a
great.
little humbling to try to speak in front of people who knew him personally, but I understand he was charismatic in a quiet way. People were drawn to him and wanted to hear what he had to say, and I think he tended to be pretty spare with his words in conferences and in public settings, which I guess made each and every word more valuable.
There were certain artworks that we know Erikson was directly connected to. This is actually one of them, Norman Rockwell's 1959 Saturday Evening Post cover called Family Tree. And during the course of several months when Rockwell was actually working on the book, on this illustration, Erikson would stop into his studio and evaluate the various portraits and faces that he included in this family tree that kind of led to what he called the all-American boy. And the struggle between them, which I wouldn't call a struggle, but conversation, was how Rockwell should start this tree, which gave a sense of identity. And of course, what you actually see here is a pirate who had captured a Spanish princess. And Erikson could not understand why Rockwell would want to start this family tree with a scoundrel. And Rockwell tried some other solutions. He tried a Puritan, just wasn't working. And eventually he went back to the pirate and the captured princess and said, basically everybody has a black sheep or two in their family. So it was kind of that sense that Rockwell had of always understanding the underlying qualities of, I guess, the psyche and who we really are.
Well, it's such an interesting tilt. I think that Erikson in this case is wanting something more idealized, and yet, as we learned in our work, there was also a time when Erikson was trying to encourage Rockwell not to only paint from an idealized point of view. So it seems like they were both wrestling with idealization or not, and how to think more realistically about the lives we lead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very important point that, you know, when we think about Rockwell in certain ways, I think he painted his happiness, but I think Erikson encouraged him to paint from places of discomfort and to express his feelings about things that he felt needed to be changed. And that's really where he launched into some of his more important socially conscious works in the 1960s. So I think Erikson clearly was a great influence there. One of the things that I found very interesting that I really didn't know very much about was who was Austen Riggs. And then in your archives was this book.
Right, we have, there's a collection of these books. The treatment in the early part of the 20th century was, in the mental hygiene movement and moral therapy, was really about right living and being orderly and having a schedule and not doing anything too excessively, but reaching for moderation. And so Austen Fox Riggs was a physician who was in New York City, and he got tuberculosis, so he came up here to Stockbridge for the rest cure, and about 1907 in that neighborhood. His in-laws were the McBurneys, who had a large house here in town, and so he and his wife, Alice McBurney Riggs, came up here, and he was recovering, and he would talk to people who were troubled, and he realized he was good at it, and he was interested in it, and he developed although he's an internist, not trained in mental health, developed a little cottage industry of talking to people who were suffering from nerves, and then wrote these little pamphlets, more like fireside chats with patients to sort of help them get back on track. And they're very interesting to read. They're full of sort of wholesome suggestions, not to do anything too excessively, and to know your part and to play your part, and those sorts of aphorisms, I guess we would say now.
Did the Austen Riggs open setting come down from him?
It did. You know, he started it. It was an open setting in the beginning because there were no buildings, no campus really. People just came as outpatients, and they were in treatment with him and living in the local community. And it took a while for them to then develop residences for people to live in. But it's always been an open setting, a completely open setting. We've never had anything but that. It's highly unusual, but it's part of what makes treatment work, because patients get to try their freedom out, make their mistakes, have their successes, but take responsibility and take charge of how it is they're going to live their lives with some help from the staff.
And I wanted to share these wonderful photographs of Mary Rockwell, Norman Rockwell's wife, actually creating her own artwork. There was an important program that was started by Joan Erikson,
Right.
I guess with Erik, called the Activities Program, and which led to the Lavender Door.
Right, the Lavender Door is on Main Street in Stockbridge. Exists very much now as it did back then when she created it. And she had been a dancer. She had gone to Vienna as a dancer and was very interested in creativity and art. And so she started an activities program that involves painting and theater and woodworking and ceramics and fiber arts and a greenhouse and a nursery school, and felt that creativity and learning something about the process of making art was a great value to human development. And she wanted a space where people could be students and learners and not patients, because one of the risks of long-term treatment that people worry about is becoming a professional patient, developing an only patient identity. And of course they were sensitive to, you can have pursue other types of identities. You need to find out about your creative self and your self as a learner. And one of our potter said a couple of years ago in a meeting that was stunning, the shop is important because we give people a place to fail. And of course all art requires that a person tolerate failure and be able to work with that and keep at it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the excuse me, artworks in the exhibition is a small ink drawing of Rockwell sitting before his canvas with his head in his hands in complete agony. And it actually was the opening page of a chapter in his autobiography called Flops, where he talks very openly about the things that, you know, he struggled with and he felt were not successful. So that concept of things not always going
Right.
exactly as we think is important for an artist. But speaking of artwork, I thought I would flash through a little bit of Erikson's own woodcuts, which are quite extraordinary. You know, they're almost apocalyptic in certain ways.
They are. There's a large horizon in them, in their sort of grand scope.
Yes.
And it was just thrilling to see them with you and with Venus and Mary at the Houghton Library.
Sometimes they're biblical in
Yeah.
nature, as in this one, Moses parting the Red Sea.
Mother and child.
Yeah, so the theme of mother and child seemed to figure pretty heavily in his work. In this case, actually, this is a portrait of his son, Kai Erikson, who also became a psychotherapist.
A sociologist.
Sociologist,
A distinguished
okay.
sociology professor at Yale.
And he was about 14 years old when this was done.
Yeah.
And actually, here are two prints that incorporate both religious themes and the concept of mother and child. And is that because that initial exposure to caretakers is so significant, do you think?
Caretakers and mothering. Erikson was said to be very maternal in nature, and I like where this eye to eye, where the mother and a child meet one another's gaze in these early ways, and research now shows how important that is for mothers and children to have that eye contact, and that facial expression and reciprocity is an important part of social and emotional development. So I think he got it very early on that this was important. He was also very conflicted about his religious identity. Joan was Anglican, his wife was Anglican, of course he was Jewish, and they were back and forth about this. Friedman's biography is great. They had 3 weddings, one to please everyone. You know, they had a church wedding, they had a Jewish wedding, they had some other sort of civil wedding, and they were like pretending to be, you know, whoever they were supposed to be in that moment to please all the parents. So that was complicated. He changed his name. You know, he came here as Erik Hamburger in 33, and when he became a citizen at, I think, 38, 39, he changed his name to Erik Hamburger Erikson. Later he dropped the Hamburger and he just became Erik H. Erikson. So he was always reinventing himself in some way or crafting his own identity. But so this religious theme is complicated in where that comes from.
Well, and it's interesting because Rockwell, who was a great humanitarian, and which really is revealed in his work, was not religious as an adult, though he grew up in a religious family.
Right. And it seems like he was interested in his painting, depicting religious people, particularly I'm thinking about the Golden Rule. And
yes, and in fact, it's one of the great connections that we found between Rockwell and Erikson was in talking about the Golden Rule. Erikson, I believe in 1953, went to India and gave a speech that addressed the fact that the Golden Rule is actually represented in many world religions.
Right.
And he actually named those religions at that time. And basically around that time, Rockwell began work on a drawing that depicted the peoples of the world and the United Nations. And then eventually what you're seeing here is he worked on a major artwork painting called The Golden Rule, which was published on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post in 1961. So, you know, you really start to see evidence of maybe the kinds of conversations that were influential and that were brought forward by both men in different ways.
Erikson's paper is first delivered as an address at the Harvard Medical School in an ethics lecture on the Golden Rule in '62. So maybe he was inspired by Rockwell to get back to it and try to make something of it.
Yeah, so the timing was really interesting. There's the Lavender Door, and of course, Joan and Erik Erikson.
Right.
And this is kind of interesting. The gentleman that you see on your left is a man named Bill Scoville. He was actually a wonderful photographer who was working, I think, in teaching at the Lavender Door, but was also a Riggs patient. And we very fortunately received a beautiful collection of his images for the Norman Rockwell Museum's archive several years ago, a number of years ago now. But there he is with Rockwell. Rockwell was very invested in photographic reference, and so the images were very important.
What year would this have been about, ballpark?
Probably, I would say, mid-50s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think Scoville worked with Rockwell for about 10 years,
Okay.
and he moved to Stockbridge in 1953. Yeah. But Jane, this is an example of what you were mentioning earlier. We see Erikson kind of carrying through his artistry in a very different way. What's going on here, do you think?
I think he's taking notes. I'm not sure if those are case conference notes, but he's making references and doodling, and that, I have to say, that person looks like they're in some kind of agony. I don't know if that's the therapist or the patient. It's hard to tell.
Yeah, it's funny.
Who he's drawing.
They're not always flattering portrayals. But it's interesting to see the notes that he's taken, and probably having that visual memory of the person by making a little sketch, perhaps.
Yeah, we have therapists on staff who are very artistically talented, and in case conferences they continue to do portraiture such as this. So there is something for some people, I think, that they listen best while they're also representing something visually and translating it.
Well, maybe we'll open up for questions in a minute, but I'll just mention that one of the interesting back and forth correspondence that we have between Rockwell and Erikson came at a time in 1955 when Rockwell was taking a trip around the world for Pan American Airlines. Remember Pan Am? And the idea was that Rockwell was to make air travel accessible and normalized. So he went to, 13 countries in something like 6 weeks on a whirlwind trip. But what's really wonderful is some of the letters, and one of the things that is under discussion apparently is whether Rockwell will have a revelation about his own work and what he should be doing with his work. Because even though he was extremely successful as an illustrator, the art world didn't always think highly of illustration, and Rockwell wondered if he should kind of experiment with a different path. And so here he's actually in Karachi, Pakistan, September 29th, 1955. He says, "Today we leave for Calcutta, cutting out New Delhi so as to lengthen our time at Hong Kong, Bangkok, and Japan. Beirut was a beautiful, prosperous tourist city. Karachi is really India, picturesque beyond words, camels, turbans, veils, but poverty I have never dreamed existed." At the end of the letter, he basically says, "Been too busy, but maybe it will hit me over Formosa Strait." So he's talking about no revelation from above on my future in the art world. So, even as a very popular artist, he was still thinking about what he should be doing.
And a difficult time in his family life in 1955.
Yeah, exactly. Is there anything you'd like to add, Jane, that you think it's important to bring forward?
Well, just that the collaboration between the two have learned so much about Rockwell and about Erikson. And so it's been delightful to have this as part of our centennial and to enlarge our footprint.
It's been wonderful for us as well.
We have a small exhibition in our Main Street Corner House gallery,
It's
thanks
really
to
terrific.
Laurie's suggestion. We invite people to come see that, but this is so spectacular. And I'm very happy with the photograph in the gallery of the two couples, Erikson and Joan, and Rockwell and Molly in the studio together. I can remember when we first came here, met with you and with Venus and going through your archives, and we saw that picture. It was breathtaking for me to see that piece of history and to see it here and to realize we have so much to learn from our neighbors about ourselves and about our neighbors.
Yeah, and actually Rockwell is known to have said that he didn't quite know where he would be without Erik Erikson. Yeah. Erikson had a tremendous impact over a period of, almost 10 years. And they remained in touch after that. Mm-hmm. So it was both a therapeutic relationship and a friendship, so it seems.
I can imagine it enlarged both of their horizons and helped them grow. And I think clearly helped Erikson think about his writing, particularly his Golden Rule piece and identity again. And I have to imagine it meant so much to Erikson to have this star who represents American life in a particular way as someone that he could talk to. And learn from.
I'll just leave one one closing note on another interesting connection that we found between them. In 1969, which of course was much later, I believe he stopped working with Erikson in about 1960 when Erikson went to Harvard. But in 1969, Erikson wrote a piece about the space race and really questioning whether we should be committing resources or such substantial resources to space exploration when we have so much work to do here on Earth. And that very same year, in 1969, Rockwell wrote kind of an essay which he presented at his Monday evening club called Lunacy, ? And Rockwell's question was the same.
Right.
You know, is this prudent to be thinking about, you know, spending so much when humanity has so much need here on Earth?
There's a moving story in Friedman's biography that I think on the moon landing, Erikson is in the waiting room while his daughter, his youngest child, is having her first baby. And the baby is born, and there's Erikson, his son-in-law, are sitting there waiting, and some newscaster says, "This is the best week for humanity ever." That's a paraphrase. And Erikson was thinking, no, every time a child is born, it's the best potential week for humanity, that our promises with our children. And it's right now, it's not, you know, somewhere else on another planet. But it was very moving to read that in the biography.
Well, thank you for this great conversation and for being the best colleague ever. I wonder if anybody has questions. I think that's an important question. It seems to me that that was probably one of the most important impacts that he had on Norman Rockwell. You know, that he encouraged Rockwell to paint about the things that he felt were uncomfortable. Rockwell tended to, I think he loved human nature. He said himself that he preferred to paint positive depictions of things. And, you know, I think it gave him the permission in certain ways to move ahead in his work and to really confront the things that were happening in the 1960s. You know, a lot of dramatic social change. So I would probably say that those conversations were really helpful for him in that way. But, you know, being a working illustrator, the constant deadlines, struggles with what to paint, is it significant? As I understand it, Rockwell struggled more than anything with his Saturday Evening Post covers, sometimes to the point of not being able to stop working, not being able to let it go. So I think, you know, having someone like Erikson to bounce ideas off of and kind of get permission to be himself was probably really useful.
And he's also written a biography of Erikson.
Really?
Yes. So there are several biographies of Erikson. Cole's is one. A guy named Burston is from Pittsburgh is another one. Larry Friedman's, same as Rockwell, multiple biographies, different takes in each one.
So right here in Stockbridge, all these big people were
Right.
mixing it up.
And Rockwell illustrated Robert Cole's book, The Dead End School.
Right.
So you're right, there were these nice relationships among them.
I think marvelous talk here earlier in the season by Erik Erikson's daughter, Sue Bloland, and she talked about the fact that Rockwell had come to fame early and had been used to being famous for a long time, and Erikson came to fame late. That book, 1950 book, Childhood and Society, put him on the map, but it didn't really put him on the map until 1960 when it was issued as a textbook, and then college students were reading it everywhere. So I think Rockwell was way ahead and had a much longer period of celebrity certainly than Erikson did, but I can imagine Erikson having something to learn from Rockwell about, well, what do you do with this kind of celebrity? I don't know much about their relationship after 1960, but certainly Erikson, towards the end of his life, can't remember the man's name, wrote a scathing review of Erikson in the New York Book Review around his Jewish identity. that was really vicious in many ways and angry. And I think by the end of his career, there was a lot of criticism of Erikson's work, and certainly the psychoanalytic police of the last century were certainly vigilant about what counted as psychoanalysis and what doesn't. And Erikson was, by the most orthodox, placed outside of that. But I think he had his ideas about human development.
Yeah, that's true. At Rockwell, I think as famous as he was, he saw people he knew very closely be completely lost to history. Like, for example, the illustrator J.C. Leyendecker, who was 20 years his senior, who had done, the same amount of post covers that Rockwell did. The most famous post artist before Rockwell really came to be completely lost. And I think Rockwell saw that, was concerned about that, concerned for reputation in certain ways, saw younger artists coming up behind him. And so I think he was always in a race with himself in certain ways.
I have some ideas about that. I don't know. They're personal ideas. I think therapists learned over time that the transference of the relationship with a therapist is very powerful, and it's easy to get into trouble, and it's easy to get into mischief. And the clearer one can be about the frame of treatment and holding those boundaries, it protects the space for the psychotherapy. And I think there's a sense of needing to protect a space that is for the patient and the patient's exploration and not the therapist's gratification or in that way. And so it's hard for me to imagine how they managed that, but they certainly weren't the only two therapist-patient pairs in Stockbridge who were navigating the social and the professional. But the guilds of psychiatry, psychology, social work have gotten much more clear about what's expected professional behavior, not having what's called a dual relationship, which this would have been considered a dual relationship, and that's an ethical problem by today's standards, which have evolved certainly since that time.
Right.
I suppose, yeah. And it's not clear what kind of, I'm not sure, whatever goes on in a therapy relationship is so private. So we know more about the public friendship aspect of that, but we don't really have a window into the psychotherapy and what that was like.
I think for Rockwell, his art became his political stand. So when he left the Saturday Evening Post in 1963 for a variety of reasons, and went to Look magazine, where he was going to be free to express personal opinions through his work. I think what he came to realize was that as a commercially popular illustrator whose art was being seen by millions at a glance, that he could really have an impact, and that was the way he did it.
Erikson was very careful about his image. And he was very grateful as an immigrant in this country to have come to this country. So he would not sign anything. Friedman takes this up in the biography. There's a very moving thing about today's situation, a very moving part of that biography where Erikson talks about how gracious people were to him when he came to this country and he didn't know the language, how welcoming. But he would not sign a petition against the Vietnam War at Harvard. He would not sign, he wouldn't sign the loyalty oath. He felt somehow to protest against the government was to not be grateful as an immigrant. That's Friedman's interpretation. And so I think much to people's disappointment and surprise, Erikson would not put his name to any sort of petition, and his name would have meant so much to a lot of those people in those petitions, but he always had an objection about the language or the way it was worded, or he didn't know enough about it. There was always that reticence, because I think he felt like he would betray this country in some way if he were to protest.
And he did actually admit on television that he made Nixon look a lot better than he actually did. So that was the idea.
Much of a course correction.
Thank you, that was a good point.
So that's interesting, because Erikson, the same thing. Erikson was convinced. He never did. He searched and he looked, even late in his life, for his father's identity, his paternity. but he was convinced that his biological father must have come from some kind of aristocracy, Danish aristocracy, and had that same idea that he came from sort of noble origins.
That's a great observation. Thank you. Well, Ramel, were you going to say? No. Okay. We thank you all for coming. It's great to spend the evening with you.
Yes.
Thank you.